Good morning. Welcome to the October meeting of our subcommittee. Thank you all for joining us here today. Another great meeting coming up, and we will start with reviewing the minutes. If anyone has a motion.
I move.
Second.
Any questions or comments? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you all. We have a report on good news on the Section 8 Management Assessment Program for information only, and items 4 and 5 are for consent unless anyone has any questions on those. More good news, though.
Okay. I'll make a motion to move staff recommendation.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously, so that included some good news on VASH vouchers. Very exciting, doing more to help our agenda for veterans and ending homelessness. And now Phoenix Parklet program, which has gotten some good press on the news leading up to today, so exciting as we move forward in that area.
I'll make sure I call on this one.
Madam Chair, subcommittee members, we came and spoke with you a few months ago about the sort of the beginnings of this, and you gave us some guidance, and we are back with details and a proposed policy.
Thanks, Rick. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, you'll recall that parklets are urban green space that can be used to mitigate heat island impacts as well as create new seasonal pedestrian spaces. It does improve the public space and visual appearance of some of our public rights-of-way within the downtown neighborhoods and commercial corridors. Parklets are a seating platform for two or more curbside parking spaces, and they help create activity along the streetscape. They can be used by the public or controlled by an adjacent business. As Rick mentioned, we did appear back in May on this issue, and since that time, Ms. Stotler has led the effort in working with the Streets Department, Law Department, Water Services, and Neighborhood Services Department, and she's going to walk us through the specifics of our program today.
Thank you, Alan. Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee, the direction we received back in May was to proceed with a public and private option for parklets, so we did so. We did some research on other cities and kind of forged some policies that will be in keeping with other cities and also keep the costs low for our constituency here. Parklets can be used in one of two ways. Public seating, which is the most common use in some of the major cities like San Francisco and New York and Philadelphia. It can also be used for private use for the business that is adjacent to the parklet, for restaurants serving non-alcoholic beverages and food, or for businesses such as bookstores and things like that. We are going to offer the option of public versus private, either one you choose. If you choose to go private, though, in order to avoid the gift clause, you're going to have to pay a rental fee for the space in the right-of-way. So working with the Street Transportation Department on right-of-way rental fees for other purposes, and as well as conferring with economic development for office space, maybe Class C office space. We came up with $10 per square foot, and I'll go over that in the cost, but it's a pretty reasonable price. It's pretty consistent with the other cities like Long Beach and Portland, Oregon, that are offering private use. You can also use the parklet for one more use, a temporary use for a special event. If you're joining in a big First Friday or Art Detour special event, you'll want to put in a temporary use permit and go ahead and serve outside during that event. The cost, as I was speaking of, we try to keep the cost very low as directed by you and our infill advisory group to try to incent people from coming in to come in and build parklets. We have a very low one application fee that covers the planning and development plan review, it covers the revocable permit with streets, and it covers the inspection by planning and development. So one application fee of $500 covers all of that. We will, if there are existing meters in the spaces that you want to use for your parklet, you'll have to pay $300 per meter for removal and placement somewhere else in the city. Construction of the parklets are generally ranging from $10,000 to $20,000 based on other cities' experience. We're doing our best to keep that cost low by providing a standard plan for the base and for the railings for construction, so that if we provide that cost, the other architectural features can be done possibly a very low cost with some design assistance from somebody maybe donating their time to cut that cost way down for people. It might even cut it down $3,000 to $5,000. So we should have that standard plan. We're working with a consultant from Street Transportation Department to come up with a standard plan with 4 options, and we'll have that in January or February. Annual fees, so after you get the parklet constructed and all finished, you have to pay an annual fee to renew your revocable permit, $380, and another rental fee of $10 per square foot. Most parklets are going to be around $2,400 for the annual rental fee. Each parking space in the city in the downtown area is about 6 foot by 21 feet. So the annual rental fee is about $2,400, which is not very expensive. There's no fee if you go public. So your only annual fee for that would be a $380 fee to update your revocable permit. So the approved area for parklets, we had some direction to look at Grand Avenue in addition to the downtown code area that we introduced before. And the downtown code area is bounded by north by McDowell and south by Buckeye, 7th Avenue to 7th Street in general. We did speak with Streets and work on including Grand Avenue from 7th Avenue all the way up to Roosevelt, where they did the streetscaping work to include that in the parklets program. And we found ways to include that. Depending on their location, we may need some extra safety measures because the speed limit is 35 miles per hour. We want to make sure people sitting in those parklets are safe, but we think we can do that with some extra curbing and maybe some hard hit post and reflective signage. So we're going to go ahead and include them.
Can I ask a question in
Yes.
particular, Grand Avenue? Madam Chair. I figure it's a bit easier to do this dialogue. On Grand Avenue, the traffic, obviously it's 35 and it's a safety issue for me on Grand Avenue, and I'm sure for all of us. But it's also, now that it's down to 1 lane, the congestion of the traffic and the construction of all these dynamics happening on Grand Avenue. How are we going to litigate the traffic or the flow of it? Sorry, Ray.
I think we're probably best to ask Mr. Giovalina to come up. There actually is some work being done on the greater Grand Avenue in terms of planning and capacity and eliminating things like too many curb cuts and things like that when you go northwest of Roosevelt. And that plan also includes more clear direction for people to get off of Grand before they hit Roosevelt, to get on the I-10, to get on McDowell Road. Ray either might want to elaborate on that, but he may have some other answers as well.
Thank you, Rick. Madam Chair and Councilwoman Pastor. What we worked on was a collaboration about 2.5 years ago with Parks Department and also the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. They had actually provided a grant opportunity for us to work together and develop a concept for that corridor. And that concept, working with the community, they looked at basically what we have now, but we understood that funding was an issue, and so we wanted to see if we could do something with striping, with some of the elements that we put out there to kind of begin the conversation of how can the ultimate condition be along that corridor. And this is what you see now, some of the removal of that 4th lane on either side, and looking towards maybe some potential funding in the future to incorporate more of the fiscal elements along that corridor. There are some aspects that with Arizona Department of Transportation we're working on for the whole Grand Avenue corridor and looking at what are the things that need to happen within this one segment, and we're working through that as we move forward for the future.
And Madam Chair and Councilwoman Pastor, one other thing to add is we've received that input before, and we've looked at signal timing issues and other elements to kind of help mitigate, particularly rush hour traffic is a little bit challenging through that area.
It is, because I take Grand to come into the city, and between 7 and 9, it's pretty tight and can be difficult at times. And then when I'm leaving the city, especially at 5, I mean, you see it right when they all meet, all the 4 corners meet, and you have traffic in the middle of Van Buren, 7th, and it's not flowing. And so those are just some of the dynamics of thinking. If I'm sitting out having dinner at trying to get in there at dinner at 5:30, those are the dynamics that I was looking at for this. I think it's an excellent idea, and we should move forward on it, but these are just some of the details that I always look at. So, thank you. Mitigate, not litigate.
Maybe some of both.
Moving on with the process, parklets will require the community support of the other members of businesses along the block. We require support from the 2 adjacent businesses next door. If you're on the corner, obviously you don't need one, but 2 adjacent businesses next door to understand you're taking up those parking spaces. And then 51% of the block, as we do in most zoning cases. So if you have one owner and they're in support of the whole block next door, you're fine, things like that. The approval process, we're putting together a website with all the documentation, all the policies, all the procedures to facilitate people getting through the whole process and have everything in one spot to go look at, and information on design and applications and things like that. The first application we're going to ask people to submit is a fact-finding application. This is a free process. They can give us a little sketch of their design. They don't have to hire an architect or an engineer to sketch it. Hand sketch is fine. Give us the location, how much space you want to use, and what you're proposing to do. And I will shepherd these applications through the first year because we're not expecting to have very many, and it's a new process. So I will meet with the Street Transportation and the Water Services Department representatives to look at the application, look at the area, make sure they're not blocking any manholes or driveways or bus stops or anything like that that we're concerned about, and then hopefully give approval to the location. So again, that's free, so that they haven't put any costs into design or anything until we've approved the location. Once we approve the location, we'll tell them they can go ahead and submit their application, go ahead and pay that $500 application fee, and start designing and working on the other requirements. So final approvals, when they get it in, we'll obviously have construction plans and permits. Again, I'm hoping to have that standard plan that they can just submit and then not pay for design costs for that. We do encourage them to add architectural features or art features or plants and landscaping just to make them singular and in keeping with the business design in the neighborhood. They have to pay for a revocable permit, which again is $500. The usual fee is, I think, $1,300 for a commercial business. So we're keeping it costs very low, trying to encourage people to submit for these. With the revocable permit comes a maintenance agreement so that they are required to keep the parklet free of graffiti, free of trash, gum, anything else that looks terrible. They need to spray off the parklet, the seating and all that stuff, take it in and take it out and make sure it's maintained and in good order. They also have to require, or they have to submit for a cash bond of $500, and we will keep that in development services and or planning and development. And if they, for some reason, go out of business or we have to remove the parklet for an emergency, we will cash in that cash bond and street transportation will come in and remove that parklet. They also are required to have insurance, a minimum amount of insurance with the revocable permit. It's a standard insurance requirement that goes with any revocable permit. It's $300,000 in liability for single family and $2 million in liability for commercial. With that, our staff is requesting that this subcommittee recommend council approval to implement the Phoenix Parklet program, and I'll answer any questions that you have.
Wonderful, thank you. So very exciting, add to our continuously growing and more vibrant downtown, so exciting program. I am one of the co-chairs of the graffiti task force, so I feel the need to ask about anything we might be doing to make sure these parklets stay graffiti free. So we have significant expertise in our public art folks and neighborhood services as well, and surfaces that are better than others and other techniques.
That's a very good question. We obviously have the maintenance agreement. We're requiring them to keep it graffiti free. Based on your concerns, I will go and talk to neighborhood services and maybe get a list of surfaces that are better for design and encourage those kinds of surfaces on these parklets to make sure that they don't have graffiti stuck on them. Yes.
Our folks have learned a lot about what services make sense and are easier to clean, and we might as well share that with the individuals who are willing to step up and help make our downtown a little bit stronger.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about why we decided to make them alcohol-free?
We actually didn't decide that. That is the law. We cannot serve alcohol across the right-of-way, and they have to cross the sidewalk, which is the right-of-way between the restaurant and the parklet. So we're not allowed to serve alcohol across the right-of-way at this point.
So if there were, say, a large event that would have an alcohol special event liquor license throughout downtown, you still could not drink in a parklet?
With a special event liquor license, you could do that, which is why the temporary use permit and special event.
Madam Chair, if they came in as part of their special event and they have to delineate what the boundaries are for that and get approved through an administrative temporary use permit, if they included the parklet area, we would let them do that as part of that larger approval process, because it allows them to do that in the right-of-way specifically.
Great. Questions?
I do. I really like what you came up with. I think it's a great direction for the city of Phoenix. If you look at other places around the country, they've done a really good job of implementing this. And that you can tell from at least the direction, that the direction really is more toward public versus the private side. Let me bring up what would be considered a pretty sensitive issue. What happens if, like in the downtown area, you've got a transient that decides to make that person's next 3 or 4 hours where they get to sit at a table? What happens?
Councilman, we will be working closely with the downtown security, Phoenix Police Downtown Security Unit, and talking to them about that. Obviously, we would need a complaint, or we'd probably hear a complaint from the business, and try to get some security over there. If it's a private parklet, if they are paying for that space in the right-of-way, they can remove or ask that transient to move. If it's public, it's a little bit more difficult.
Well, I think it's completely difficult. I mean, essentially, somebody can legally sit down for 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, and you've literally taken away from this individual's right to be able, they put an investment there, they put in $10,000 to $20,000. And then, I mean, if you're looking at a potential of this failing, it could be because of opening it up that way. You've got to allow some private property owners, and I know how you did it through here, but I want to discuss that in a second, to be able to move people along. You're putting all the burden on them to keep it clean, to do all those things, but at the same time, you're giving them no authority to be able to do that unless they went private. I get that part of it.
Mhm.
The question I've got here then, and I get the $10 per square foot, but and that I assume is under a 1-year agreement.
Mhm.
Why not look, and you want to be able to do both. Okay, the way not you, I don't mean it that way. I mean, the way this has been set up literally discourages anybody being able to have control over the asset that they've been able to put together. It just does that. Why not allow a 3-year agreement where you have phased in rents? So 3 years also gives us the ability then to budget monies forward, allows us to be able to know that we've got something here, but it also gives them an incentive to get a lower rate. So that way you could start at $5, $7, and $10 or something like that, where you can get a phase in. I'm concerned at the $10 rate, you're not going to get the kind of mix that you should have and give people the ability to be able to spread out, some level of control over the asset that they were putting in. So I would like to see, and we could find a way to pull that part out and have staff come back, if people are agreeable here, to come up with a different model or a model that might work for the private sector too.
We certainly,
Well, not the private sector, but for people choosing to go private. You've got to give them some control.
Madam Chair, Councilman
Otherwise, you're gonna have
DeCiccio,
police there all the time.
if the subcommittee wants to go in that direction, we are happy to look at that. The limiting factor for us will be the gift clause, and so we'll have to.
And I'm
determine-
glad the city is talking about the gift clause on everything now. I think that's great. That also goes across the board on everything that we do.
Right, yeah.
just
So
don't pick and
as
choose.
long as we can make sure that we are not using public dollars to create a private benefit for a particular entity, I think we could probably structure that fee in a way
Mhm.
that would avoid that. But that's why the fees were set up the way they were.
Well, I would like to take a good look at that and talk to legal about it. I mean, that's from my end. I don't know where the rest of the committee would like to go on it. But I really think it's important we give people the flexibility to be able to choose both,
Madam Chair, Councilman DeCiccio, we, as part of the process, we built into it that you could choose either scenario. So we do think that we'll probably see more people who are going to want to do the private scenario, just from the standpoint of they will be able to have more policing authority under that scenario. So they'll be able to go out and try and work on some of those issues that you mentioned. Practically, we think that's what will happen. There may be a few that a neighborhood group gets together and wants to do more of a community park, kind of parklet option that is open to the public all the time. But we think the practical application of this will be that we'll see far more private ones, and that's why we set it up the way that we did. But we
Well,
can certainly go back and look at
I would like
extending
to.
that time for, you're concerned about amortizing some of the costs of doing it and making some assurances that they're gonna get to have it for longer than just 1 year. We can certainly go back and look at that and evaluate that against the gift clause.
If
and
we
should we
could, I'd
mark that.
appreciate it, just to take a look at that. You know, it is, I mean, you've got to give people some level of control over, you know, it hurts the small business owner the most, is what it does. You know, a large user, a chain restaurant won't have as much of an issue with it. But a small owner that has one business and that wants to find a way to be creative and to expand their business, his or her business, you want to encourage them to do that. I think this is fantastic. I mean, I think it's great that the city's moving in this direction. Especially looking at Grand Avenue. I think that was Councilman Valenzuela's or Pastor, I can't remember. One of you were bringing that up,
First,
both of you.
Look at the look on her face. It was definitely Councilwoman Pastor.
Pastor.
I don't think you heard my comment. I'll just be quiet.
I thought I think it's great to look at that with all those business owners. I just think it's fantastic. You know, I'd like to see this be able to be expanded out too. One of the questions with the liquor part of it, if there were a way for us to make that work where they could be able to sell liquor in the parklets, as this thing goes on, I think that might be something we want to explore if there is a way to do that. You know,
Madam Chair, Councilman DeCiccio, one of our infill task force members, Mr. Tim Sprague, did mention that was something that he thought was worthwhile pursuing at the state. It does take some changes to the state liquor law process before we could even entertain that, but that is certainly something that could be out there more long-term.
and it's good to test it this way and then open that up, but I really think we need to do that. If you want to make these things really successful, you've got to be able to provide a whole range of services to the public.
And so the idea behind the state law was to protect people or to prevent people from entering the public space
Drinking in public.
carrying.
Yeah, it's primarily, anytime there's liquor involved, the liquor control requirements are very strict in terms of where you can actually drink. They don't want people wandering around with that. So you always have to have, like for outdoor patios, you're required to have a fence and, all those things to keep it contained in an area. So this is just a furtherance of that original idea, but it isn't something that we couldn't go back and look at long-term if there was, particularly some certain areas like this. There's other entertainment districts that other cities have, like Yuma and their downtown, that might make sense from a state law perspective change to being a little more, getting into the details a little bit more in those areas.
Because generally, it seems like a very worthwhile public purpose to keep the alcohol out, but in this narrow circumstances, it seems to be, most of the parklets I'm familiar with in other cities do have.
Yeah, it would seem to be that it's something that, from a public purpose standpoint, you could make an argument that, there's good reasons to do it in these smaller key areas.
Especially because we do, I think, as a city, have the goal of trying to get more people out in our downtown and have that safer, more vibrant feel in the downtown. Of course.
I think Councilwoman Gallego hit the nail right on the head. When you see activity outdoors, it encourages people to be there. I mean, it's just like we got into discussions on bikes in a neighborhood. When you see people biking in a neighborhood, it gives you multiple messages like, wow, it's family oriented. It's something, I feel safe here. When you see people outdoors, you see activity. When you see activity, it encourages you to stop there and encourages you to shop there. So anything we can do to get people out there, I think is good. I think this is a phenomenal plan here that somebody obviously came up with the idea. Whoever came up with it, kudos to you. I just think it's a great direction for the city of Phoenix to be going in, and we need to do this. But let's take as many barriers down as we can.
Madam Chair and subcommittee members, we would be glad to work with our staff who are expert in the liquor laws to come up with some options for the legislative program for this year to address these ideas that you have raised.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Yes.
I have some questions. So with, I believe Matt's Big Breakfast was one of our pilots. And so it's a small business. what did they face in the sense of, um, what did we learn from it? From Matt's Big Breakfast? I mean, was there a safety issue happening? Was there somebody staying there, sleeping there for a day? I mean, what are some of the dynamics that we face that we now need to work through?
So Councilman Pastor, did you want to answer that? Or?
Yeah, we can do a two-part
Okay.
answer if you want to. So kind of give you the, I'm sorry, Madam Chair and Councilwoman Pastor, what we did was, we had an opportunity to look at, last year, and looking at the connected oasis for the downtown, that whole concept that was worked through with the city and the planning department, where they were looking at areas, corridors that were more pedestrian-friendly. And so last year, the department, Street Transportation Department, moved forward with trying to condense that corridor with other construction activities that we already had done. If you can imagine the portion that's south of McKinley on First Street, that was a project that we were using bond funds, and we actually have other projects coming online to do more of that. And so it was an attempt to look at what could be in the future. And so that's what we tried to do with the striping that we did out there. And then the whole concept of a parklet was being discussed nationally, and so we took it kind of to the next level to integrate that into that project. So in reality, right now we don't have, we did it as a project for that location. We worked with that owner, the business owner, and we worked with an architect that provided free design services, and we eventually put that in there for that project. We need to go through and work through some of the documentation and working like what was provided today, because we need to have agreements, we need to have those things in place. We don't have an agreement right now with the owner, with the property owner. So we're going to work towards that to make sure that we can sustain that parklet there. With regards to safety issues, we haven't seen any issues with that. I go there regularly, and I've talked to the owners, and they fully, I mean, they really like this, and I think we're just trying to work with the community to see what's the balance in trying to incorporate this in a bigger scheme for the downtown. So.
So again, just to tack on to that, what we have learned is that the owners are very willing to take care of this space. They wash it out at least once a week or more often, depending on how dirty it is. They spray it out with a hose. They take their furniture in and out. They provide umbrellas. They really want people to stay there and enjoy the space, either when they're waiting for the restaurant or after. You can take a coffee out. You can take food out there and eat out there if it's to go, even though they can't serve you. And like Ray, I've had the opportunity to sit out there a couple of mornings, and it's a very, very enjoyable urban feel out there, watching people come and go, going to school and to work, and sitting out there, just being a part of the street activity. So it's been a very positive experience, I believe, with Matt's Big Breakfast. They love the parklet, and they take very good care of it. They hand water the plants, and they're very involved in the upkeep of the parklet.
Thank you. My other question, and I think this would be for my colleagues, as we are facing the FAA flight pattern changes, how will that affect Grand Avenue? I mean, I think this is something that we as a group collectively talk about, how we are working on our economic development, and how one of the main areas that we're have invested in is being affected by the dynamics of this. And that in our FAA conversation or with the neighborhood, it was clear, but it wasn't clear as to how we have been really revitalizing downtown and those areas in order to bring people downtown. So I think this is one good piece that we talk about in or any of my colleagues that are writing letters to the FAA, that the thrive of downtown and the economic development is crucial right now. And so that's just one of my comments to this whole process, because we're doing a lot of innovative ideas, we're putting them into play, and I just don't want to see all this work go away due to jets flying over us. So That's just one of my concerns. Thank
And
you.
it is also a concern in Central City South along Grant Park as well, so. Yes.
So if we did agree to have you come back with another private model, I think we can move the public part, everything through except for that part there. How long would it take? You know, we've got a Super Bowl coming in. I think it'd be a great time for us to be able to showcase some of this as quickly as possible. Plus, this is the time where people want to be outside. Between now and March, April of next year, this is the time for people to be outside. It takes a while for them to be able to put their capital investment in, but how much time?
Madam Chair, Councilman DeCiccio, staff would suggest that if the subcommittee is inclined to maybe provide us direction to look at extending any of the agreements up to 3 years instead of the 1 year. And we'll explore the gift clause issues. And then once we get to formal, we can then make whatever changes we need. I think 3 years will kind of give more time to amortize that cost. We think we can go back and work that out and make sure that that's what we can present at full council. And if not, we'll talk about why we can't do that and what other suggestions may be, if that's okay with the subcommittee.
I'd be open to that. That's a great idea.
That way, I think, Madam Chair and Councilman DeCiccio, we won't have to slow down the process
You don't
too
want to.
much. So we'll when we, if that's the direction that the subcommittee gives us, when we bring it to council, we'll build that in unless there's some reason we can't.
Right. Okay. I like it. I mean, and when do you think the first parklet, other than Matt's, could be opened up? I mean, let's say, when are we expecting to go to council on this? Next week? That's fast.
We go to in a
I'm trying to
month,
put a little pressure on to
take
get it
about
done.
a couple months, January or February, if somebody really
council.
wants to do it very quickly.
Oh, well, the reason why is that once you're in January, then your construction phase is going to be, 30 days by the time you go through the city, get the construction in.
Actually, the parklets are put on little things called bison pedestals. It's a very, very quick setup. So once they're ready to go, I think a week or maybe 2 weeks at the most to get it constructed.
Is there any way to move it faster than that? And the reason I'm asking is time. Oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering, do we want this up for Super Bowl? Is that where we're?
I just don't want to
So-
miss the high season
right.
right now for retailers and restaurants.
Because I'm personally shepherding all these
You would
applications
know,
through,
yeah.
I will speed them up as much as possible. What we really need is someone to come in and want to do it and have the money to do it, and we'll make it as speedy as possible through our process.
No, I mean, when can we get to council so then that gives them the opportunity rather than
But
January?
we'll go as fast as we can to bring this to the city council. Your next available meeting is the 5th. We haven't hit the deadline for that yet,
Of November?
5th of November. It may be possible for us to hit that deadline. We'll
If
see.
you
If
can.
not, it would be the meeting immediately following, and we'll go as fast as we can.
Not trying to put more pressure on it. It's just that this is, yeah, sure.
That's exactly what we-
I know I am. I'm trying to be subtle about it.
Yeah.
It's just that I think it's such a creative idea, and to be able to move this and be able to get it through the city and allow individuals to be able to start recapturing whatever investment that they're going to have in that, now is the time to do that.
So the next formal is November 5th or the 19th.
Okay,
It'll be on one of those two ones as quick as we can get it back.
sounds good.
And at least one member of the task force did have some concerns about the private parklets, so could you sort of rephrase those for us so that we can make sure we don't forget that?
Go ahead.
Okay, Councilman, I believe the concern was that it's public right-of-way, and the concern was we are using public right-of-way for private purposes, for private gain. And as I said, we did research, and several other cities are offering the private option. It seems to be more popular. When we went out and spoke to Downtown Partnership and even the Infill Advisory Group and business owners, they were much more favorable towards the private option because of the investment that has to go into this parklet. As Councilman DeCiccio was saying, the only return on investment they can see is if they can serve or use this parklet and control the parklet. So we felt that that was a good option. The way to get these built and to encourage these to be built was to offer the private option.
And Councilwoman Gallego, we did also send out notice of this meeting to our Infill Advisory Group, and that's where that issue came up, inviting them to the meeting today. So I think we gave them the draft as well, so I think everyone's okay. I know it probably wasn't his druthers, but I think he understands.
Great. Wonderful.
Are you gonna go? Go, because I don't know your
And
little
if,
pieces.
if you could put graffiti in the
Yeah.
motion, that would be
Oh,
excellent
yeah,
as well.
Well, I'd like to move forward with staff recommendation, but to also come back with an option to allow individuals to do a longer-term lease in order to amortize their costs. With a strong emphasis on graffiti, that the owners, which makes it a revocable issue, I can make it as strong as you want to graffiti, because I feel the same way you do on this, is that if the owners are not keeping up with their property, in particular to graffiti, then city staff can get in there and revoke that permit. I mean, that's a critical component. It is, because that's your packaging, you know. And I think, and to come back as soon as possible, either November 5th or November 19th. But that doesn't mean November 19th, that means push for November 5th. Not trying to put pressure on you to do it.
And when you say come back, I think we're all comfortable going
the
straight to the
council.
full council.
Full council with some recommendations, if that works. And then we're also, just to reiterate as well too, we're looking at maybe a week's process in the approval stage. Is that correct? Cindy, you would know.
Councilman, it will probably take a couple of days for the fact finding for us to, we'll want to go out and visit the site and make sure it's an appropriate space. And then the application process should take about a week or 2 weeks at the most if we have any issues, but it's a very simple construction project, so it should be very quick.
You know, one of the things too, as you move forward, not part of the motion, encourage people to look at these standardizations as much as you standardize it as possible. Okay, that's my
Second.
motion.
Any discussion? All right, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Wonderful, thank you. This will be exciting. We look forward to the first ribbon cutting of a parklet under the new policy.
So, Madam Chair, the next item is also us coming back, but it's slightly different. When we went to the city council and made changes to temporary fence requirements focused on golf courses, the mayor and one or more council members expressed concern about or question about whether or not we ought to consider applying similar standards to other private properties, not just to golf courses. And so that's what we're here today to talk about. And we're really just seeking your direction on whether you wish to expand this kind of policy to areas other than beyond golf courses.
Thanks, Rick. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. I'm here with Sandy Hoffman and Mr. Chris Hallett. And Sandy's been working on this, the draft text amendment that was done for the golf courses, you recall, back in June. She'll walk us through a little bit of that. The key issue that we were able to address with the golf course text amendment was kind of the visual impacts of temporary fences while still providing the safety element of securing a building or a safety hazard. And that was done because there's a larger area associated with the golf course. And so it's a little more difficult for staff to address those issues in terms of the visual impacts from a fence and still maintain the safety aspects of it on smaller properties that you just don't have that room to work with. And so with that, I'll let Ms. Hoffman walk us through the background.
Good morning, Madam Chair, subcommittee members. I'll provide a brief overview of the temporary fence regulations. So temporary fences are now allowed for 1 year unless you can demonstrate at least one of the following 3 items: that there's ongoing environmental remediation activities occurring, there's an existing safety hazard on the site, or there is a building project happening and you have regular inspections occurring. So a temporary fence needs to either have a temporary fence permit, or it has a valid approved building or construction permit, or you have an active temporary event permit for something such as a carnival. So temporary fences are limited to a maximum of 8 feet in height unless you get a use permit to allow additional height, and you have to show that it doesn't have a problem with the public safety, as well as there's a minimal impact to the adjacent properties. Barbed wire and concertina wire is no longer allowed on top of a temporary fence if it's visible from the right-of-way or residential districts. That was included with the last text amendment we did. And we kept the part that razor wire must be a minimum of 6 feet 2 inches above the finished grade. So the example on the screen right now is a home that's vacated, perhaps due to some damage or an economic situation that occurred. And it is important to know that we do need to have temporary fencing allowed within the city because of situations such as this. We need to be able to protect those adjacent homeowners from wandering onto the property and being injured, as well as the property owner needs the ability to restrict access to their property from trespassing, vandals, and thieves. Oops, there we go. Also, with the last text amendment is the temporary fencing, as mentioned by Alan, regarding what we could do for that for golf courses. So the image on the screen shows the red circle around the water feature. Basically, temporary fencing is allowed on a golf course if it is within 5 feet of a hazard or a building. If you want to have temporary fencing around the perimeter of a golf course, you need to have a use permit, and you're limited only to the access points. So the use permit provision allows the opportunity for the neighbors to come have a voice. It also requires that the applicant provide additional information, including landscaping along the perimeter of that golf course, as well as documentation regarding why they need to have that temporary fencing. And they need to look at the golf course for what hazards are there for that golf course, the land, and the buildings. So with the public hearing process, the neighborhood has a voice, and we have the ability to mitigate any concerns that may arise from the temporary fencing.
Yeah, and the Neighborhood Services Department is responsible for enforcing this ordinance, and we do so on a complaint basis. So if we receive a complaint on a property, we first go out and we inspect it, and we provide education to the owner as to what is and is not allowed according to the ordinance. If they're found to be in violation, we issue a notice of violation, and it can carry up to a $2,500 fine per occurrence. In all of fiscal year 13-14, we only received 2 complaints. Of those, one was found not to be in violation, the other one came into compliance.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, staff's just here this morning asking for any direction you'd like to give us on this item.
Wonderful. Some of our neighboring cities, such as Scottsdale, have regulations about the appearance of the fence, including well, colors and looks, and how susceptible to some design elements to reduce the graffiti. Can you talk about what we're doing in that area?
Sure. Madam Chair, subcommittee members, we have various design guidelines for fencing. If it's a permanent fence, you need to have a certain finished appearance to that fence, and undulation and variation in the materials and finishes. For temporary fences, we aren't as restrictive. Again, we typically would expect to have some chain link fencing. And with the new regulations that we now have restricted the barbed wire portion of it. So we feel that we do have some regulations in place for the design portion of it. Graffiti, certainly, once you have a decorative fence there, there's other alternatives, as you're well aware of, that could perhaps be used to mitigate the graffiti.
Because we did get some concerns about, like, if people put vinyl up along and then that gets graffitied, how are we dealing with that? And I'll defer to.
So, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, if there is concerns about graffiti on a temporary fence, you know, we have the ability, because it's only a one-year process, to go back and talk to the applicants, and it shouldn't be a long-term problem, because they have to come in and renew every year. So if they're not responding to NSD trying to get them to comply and remove the graffiti, they can let us know when they come in for a renewal if that's what they're going to do, because they haven't fix the blight issue. Then we can address it from that standpoint as well, in terms of, we're not going to, issue this until you go fix that, so we don't continue, that problem in the community.
And they have different requirements around environmentally sensitive areas and parks. Do we do anything like that?
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, we do not for temporary fencing. We do have for regular permanent fencing, like regarding things around environmentally sensitive lands, we require the more use of view fencing and those kinds of things to actually have a visual, better visual eyes on those open space areas. But we don't have any of those requirements for the temporary fencing. Is really focused on, issues of safety in terms of a burned out building, a vacant building, those kinds of things are really where the temporary fencing regulations are used.
Any questions?
No, just a couple things. It seems like we are addressing the actual visual part of it only because a lot of these are just very tight corners, like if you have a Circle K or a 7-Eleven that's abandoned. That's done through you don't really see the fence as much as you see the blight potential on the building, and that's addressed through there. The 2 complaints is telling, that we would expect to have more if that was really the issue. This is one of those things I kind of think that we maybe have just, at least from my end, maybe to look at this a little deeper and see where we go, and monitor any type of potential complaints that we have going forward.
So if there is a use permit hearing, there'll be public notice, and it'll be clear how you can communicate if you have concerns, and that's 30 days. Will you take us through?
So, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, a use permit process takes about 6 to 8 weeks to get through. Yeah, for the city of Phoenix, we require property owners that are within 300 feet of the site to get, I'm sorry, property owners within 150 feet and neighborhood associations that are registered with the city within 600 feet to get notice. And they're invited to a public hearing to comment on the visual impact of a fence. And that only applies for golf courses per the new law that was put in place in June. For a standard temporary fence that is being used for, to safeguard a building that caught on fire or something like that, they don't have to go through that process. It's done then to secure the property.
And if people did have concerns about that, Neighborhood Services is where they should go?
Yes, Madam Chair, they would go to Neighborhood Services Department, and if there were any issues, then that's, the Neighborhood Service Department would go out and investigate, and it doesn't sound like there've been a lot of those issues and complaints.
Because one of my concerns is many times people do not know to whom they should address their complaint. So how would they know? Obviously, if they were very savvy, they might know where to go, but if you are newer to our city or not familiar with our departments, how would you know where to direct your complaint?
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, I think that's something that, if you want us to look at ongoing in the future, how to do a little bit better outreach, I think we're always looking for ways to improve in that regard. Most of the temporary fences are rented fences that, get rented from Rent-A-Fence and other companies, and they're put up and leased for, 6 months, and then hopefully they're able to fix the problem and don't have anything else at that point. But lots of times I think if there are issues in the neighborhood, they're probably getting complaints from residents for other issues, not just the fence, like some of the blight issues will probably get NSD involved as well at that time.
And Madam Chair, just to add it, I think that's the bigger issue that happens. And actually, if you make it harder to get a temporary fence, you may actually get more complaints about property blight or graffiti or whatever. So, one of the reasons why people put temporary fences up is to protect a property from vandalism or graffiti when it's open and vacant or whatever. But it doesn't completely prevent it, as we know. People climb fences and get in and do bad things to properties, and NSD gets called regularly about those as well.
Because we got some we have gotten calls about fences fell over and, other different concerns related to that. And we did not forward them to Neighborhood Services necessarily all of the time. And so I would think that just people don't know who to complain to. It was the same if you saw a Circle K that had fence issues. I don't know that you would know to complain to.
So you're
Yes.
correct, because I have that
Yes.
challenge. There's Central in Virginia, our lovely Circle K there, that has a fence up, and then dynamics of graffiti happening, blight, and everything else. So you're correct in the example. Same thing happened on 16th Street in Highland. The fence flew down, sat there for a while. And so the neighborhood started calling. And so I'm understanding we'd go to NSD to forward all those dynamics. And then from there, they'll go to wherever it needs to go to.
Correct. There would be one exception to that, and that is if it's in the right-of-way and it's a traffic and safety hazard.
Goes to Ray.
Ray would, his crews would take it out, or frankly, any police or fire folks that are going by there would also deal with it. But, in some of these storms, things are actually blocking a sidewalk or even out in the street sometimes when they blow.
Thank you. One question I had was, I heard if there is graffiti or anything on there and the property owner had not gone to clean it up, that if they showed up to get a renewal on their fence, at that point, that's where we would revoke the fence permit.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, one of the things that we can do is increase some communication between NSD and Planning and Development Department related to that. So that way, if there is something that they've sent graffiti busters out and they've done things and had problems, we can then work with them when they come back in to say, wait a minute, you've got a you've got to do something more to address this issue. And so that's something that a number of issues our departments are working better on now to make sure that we don't issue things that, that the other side of the city has been having problems with that they have not addressed. If they've addressed them and then it continues to be a problem, as long as they're continuing to address them, we wouldn't be able to say, no, you can't have your fence, permit, but we would be able to say, if you haven't responded to them saying, clean up the graffiti, then we have something to push them on at that point.
Okay, so I could be I'm just being a clever property owner. And I could be a property owner and I have a fence and I know it's up for a year. So for 11 months, I could avoid doing something to my property. But right before I'm gonna get a renewal, I go in and bring everybody together and clean up my property. I technically have cleaned up my property. So then what I'm hearing is I can get a renewal. But in this whole process, do I get fined for all this blight?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, we have our enforcement process we will do upon any complaints. What we aim to do is work with the Planning Development Department to provide a case history on the property in question for the year leading up to the renewal period, and it's up to somebody in planning to decide whether to renew.
So, Madam Chair, Councilman Pastor, I think part of the problem has been when NSD is going out and enforcing some of these things, at some point, it's difficult to continue to move that forward with the prosecutor's office and the limited resources they have to address things. So that's where the fact that we issue a permit for it can then come into play, because then we can also help on enforcement if they have not got anything through their normal process.
Would you know if the police department had received complaints about, I'm trying to think where people would call if they're unhappy about these issues. Would we know if they'd called the police to complain?
Madam Chair, we don't have that information now, but we can certainly ask and see what we can find out, and I can let you know later on.
Great, thank you.
Madam Chair, I would just encourage everybody to call Neighborhood Services Department, and we'll figure out who the necessary parties need to be if we can't handle it.
Great.
So several months ago, this began with a golf course issue. A couple of golf courses that are, one is in District 5 in Vita Paz neighborhood, just far west Phoenix, and I believe one is in District 6. And the conversation expanded into, into other areas of the city. According to the packet, only 2 complaints have been called in for whatever reason, and it could have been the fact that no one knows who to call, or it could have been, a lot of times what we get out of District 5, we always encourage people to call us, and we will, kind of like what you're talking about, Chris. We are, we promote this, no dead end kind of thing, and we will help. So I'm hoping anyone calls someone at the city, and we can figure out where that goes to. But nonetheless, at the end of the year, fiscal year 13, in this fiscal year, 13-14, or the last fiscal year, the NSD received 2 complaints for illegal fencing. One was found not to be in violation, and the second corrected the violation after receiving a formal notice of violation. I just want to be sure we, I'm a strong advocate, like everyone else on this subcommittee, for our neighborhoods, preserving our neighborhoods. I think for the most part, I'm a strong advocate, like everyone on the council. When it comes to protecting our neighborhoods, I just want to be sure we're not looking to correct an issue that doesn't exist. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or anyone?
Madam Chair, Councilman Valenzuela, I think staff's experience has been that we haven't received a lot of complaints, as evidenced by the 2 through Neighborhood Services Department. There may be other avenues. We can certainly check on that and report back if there are. But I think that the problem is, even if there is on some of these smaller properties, The only solution is to, if you're gonna, as Mr. Neymar pointed out, if you're gonna be more restrictive on temporary fencing, you're gonna have other problems that are gonna cause other problems in the community, such as people vandalizing buildings, people breaking into them, doing things inside, that the property owners are going to wanna secure their properties. And if we're gonna say you can't have a fence because the community doesn't support a temporary use permit for it, then that's gonna become a little more problematic because it'll be difficult to secure their property. Where it worked in the golf courses is you could secure the physical hazards in terms of the buildings that were on site that were vacant, or the water traps and those things. But you just don't have that room on the smaller properties to really do that. So it really becomes a choice of, are you going to address public's concerns about fence impacts, but you're going to open up to larger public concerns about private property vandalism and breaking into properties and those things to address the fence issue. Because unfortunately, we just don't have a good way on smaller properties to address that visual impact from chain link fences and still make the property safe when no one's there.
And I think, Madam Chair and Councilman, I think that's the reason why there's not a staff recommendation here. If we felt that there was a huge problem that we as staff were recommending you address, there would be a recommendation to move forward with this right now. We were really responding to the question that was asked at the council meeting by several of you as why are golf courses unique and special, and shouldn't we offer this protection everywhere? And I think the answer is, and Alan kind of said it, is golf courses, if somebody fenced an entire golf course, that impacts hundreds of people very directly with their homes. If I fence off a particular individual property, well, lots of people may see it if it's on a commercial street or even a busy residential street. It mostly directly impacts just my immediate neighbors in the way the golf course example is. And so I think there is somewhat of a difference here. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it adds a bigger burden for people. And I think from a staff perspective, we haven't had lots and lots of complaints about it. We didn't see the need to add this for other circumstances, but we wanted to come back and at least discuss the issue with you all since it was raised and we were asked to look into it.
Madam Chair?
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought too, the whole idea of unintended consequences matter here. And by taking down the fence, not allowing it to go up, you may end up having a major graffiti problem and vandalized property problem that becomes a bigger eyesore. What I would recommend, and it's up to the committee here, following what Councilman Valenzuela was just talking about, the 2 doesn't give you any information at all. And you've always got to look at what your unintended consequences are going to be here. Just monitor it. I like the idea that you're going to improve your interdepartmental communication. I think that's critical to do that, provide that information. The other, and this is not a motion, I don't know if we need a motion right now to do this. And then the other is to work closely better, because I assumed that the first call would happen. The big question is, who do they call? Mm-hmm. And that is actually a good question. It's like, who would you call? Mm-hmm. Most people wouldn't know what NSD is in the public. The ones that call on a regular basis would know, but most people wouldn't know that. The hope would be that someone like in the police department, I assume that that's the first call that they may end up getting to. I think what Chairman Gallego was talking about. So to communicate with the police department that if they do get any of these calls, that they're directed directly to NSD. So I think that would be more of a conversational, and then we can look at this when you get more information, or if you even do.
We will have blight liens coming to the committee in December, and there's some related issues to that, so we can address it then. Great.
And I don't get a chance to do this very often, but Councilman DeCiccio, strong work on the golf course fencing. We don't always agree.
Yeah,
but
we agree actually 85% of the time.
Well, you probably have the.
We agree on all the union issues, right?
Yeah,
Oh.
exactly.
No,
We're both.
Keep going.
Yeah, you had the most pro-union motion at the last council
I-
meeting, just
well, of
no one second.
All right, this has gotten out of hand.
No. You never brought it up. No.
Yeah.
All right, shall we, thank you for your presentation.
I just want to say one thing. Rick, ASU, go Devils.
Oh, it stands for anyone, Rick is a big Stanford fan.
Nice, very nice.
I'll be on video.
Welcome our housing director to talk about a new initiative related to scattered sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to come to you, talk to you a little bit about background on our scattered site program and our request for the subcommittee to approve the submittal of a Section 18 plan to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to dispose of 50 units. As you know, HUD has been underfunding public housing authorities nationwide for the last several years, which has put a significant financial constraint on public housing authorities. This proposal will allow the City of Phoenix Housing Department to be able to maintain the remainder of our public housing authority units. The other thing I wanted to make note of is to be clear that the City of Phoenix Housing Department receives no general fund in support of public housing. So we are, as the fiscal stewards of the city, required to make sure that we maintain within the available funds that we're giving to HUD. And so with that brief introduction, I'd like to actually turn over the presentation to William Emerson, who is the Deputy Director over Property Management, which includes public housing. And as this part of this process, he will actually be responsible for development and submittal and ultimate implementation of the plan as we go forward. So with that, William.
Thank you, Carl. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. Excited to talk to you today about our scattered site program, which is our most effective means of preparing our public housing residents for home ownership and self-sufficiency. We have about 408 scattered site homes spread throughout all of our districts, and they have a very special population. The folks who live in our scattered site homes earn between 40 and 80% of area median income. These are folks on the way to home ownership, and it's very good for doing that. They're responsible for the exterior of the house. Unfortunately, there are some challenges to this program. These homes are the most expensive to maintain in our entire inventory, about 40% on average than our multifamily properties. We have other challenges that are more specific, that are more general to the public housing domain. Our capital funding has been reduced by about 40% from 2009 annually, so that we're now receiving much fewer dollars than we need in order to maintain these houses at the level that our residents deserve. In addition to that, we've received less than the full operating supplement for many years now. It was down to 82% a couple of years ago. It's at 89% now. So in light of these difficulties, we're looking for sustainable solutions so that we can continue to offer a pathway to home ownership through our public housing program, but then to offer it sustainably and without any burden on the general fund. So in 2012, we went to our resident advisory board and talked about a Section 18 program. Section 18 program is an opportunity to sell some of our highest cost properties to generate some capital and to reduce the operating costs associated with those homes. So we've identified 50 dwellings in all the districts that are most expensive to maintain, most difficult to rent. For the people who are resident in these homes, they will have a right of first refusal to purchase it. They need not, and for those who choose not to, we'll provide relocation assistance, taking into account their preferences in every case possible. These homes are different from our Section 32 program, where they're offered directly to the public. There are no qualifications in order to purchase these homes, and we also don't invest any additional money in these homes. So they are sold as is, without qualification. We wanted to make sure that this was consistent with our community's vision of the scattered site program. So in addition to talking with our resident advisory board for several years, we had a public meeting back in July. We had a lot of interest and a lot of questions. We sent out notice to every one of our scattered site residents, including all those who are affected, who are on the list of 50 homes. We answered all of their questions. We actually had 4 people who attended whose homes were on the Section 18 list, who decided that they wanted to be homeowners, and so we put them on the Section 32 list. The list before you now is the final list, if approved. So we put together all those frequently asked questions. We prepared a website, we solicited public comment, we advertised for public comment, and then we advertised for a public meeting, reached out again to all of our residents, held our public meeting. We received no comments in any of those fora. So we've come to you today as the next step and to answer any of your questions and to seek your recommendation to the full council to authorize the city manager to submit a Section 18 application to Housing and Urban Development to sell 50 of our scattered sites homes. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you tell us about how you would market these homes to try to increase the likelihood that they would be purchased by owners who plan to occupy the residence, or at least are aware of it?
Absolutely, Madam Chair. We have a couple of strategies, and we're going to have a little bit of time. It'll take between 180 and 360 days for HUD to respond to our application. And in that time, we'll be working with Jones Lang LaSalle to ensure that we have adequate marketing of these properties. We're also going to be working with trying to identify community partners to see if any of these homes would be a good rehabilitation opportunity for some of the nonprofits in our community.
And then also, the point of clarification, as part of our Section 32 program, we have contracts with 3 different nonprofit organizations that help our residents walk through the qualification process, and so we would outreach to some of those organizations to help also facilitate that.
And all of these residents have had the opportunity to enter Section 32, and they're aware of the opportunity and have decided it's not a fit.
Correct.
Correct. And they remain eligible to participate in Section 32, just not on these homes.
Is this something where any of the houses could be on the multiple listing service? And
That is absolutely our intention, Madam Chair.
I think we want them, sometimes if you purchase them through a city process, you might not, most homeowners wouldn't be looking there.
That is our intention, Madam Chair.
Any other questions or comments?
Just,
Councilman DeCiccio.
oh, just a quick question. So we're expecting these to go on the market next year. Takes a year for them to give approval.
It'll take about
That is
180
slow.
days to a year.
So what happens, so the debt basically increases for the next
The
year? Do you have that
deficit.
budget- Or the deficit?
We'll manage the deficit as we have managed the deficit.
What is the deficit on these 50 homes?
We have identified a shortfall of between 250 and 350,000 across the entire portfolio
Oh.
of these scattered sites houses.
But this would be the top.
These are the most expensive
Yes.
ones.
Highest
That's correct,
maintenance
sir.
cost for us.
That's a long time to put something on the market.
Yeah, and just
Then
as also.
Our
Madam
process. Oh, go
Chair,
ahead, sorry.
Councilman DeCiccio, the other thing is that's what's also helping is the Section 32, when folks are being able to buy that, that's what's sustaining us now. And so we had approval to sell 50 of those homes. We're about halfway through that now. So as we're selling those houses, that's helping, deal with the current shortfall in the program.
This is a follow-up, just more of a curiosity question. Are we breaking even from what we paid for the homes versus what we're selling them for?
Madam
Is there an
Chair,
analysis done on that?
Councilmember DeCiccio, we are breaking even, bearing in mind that we've made capital investments and
Right.
maintenance of these properties over the years. If we include all of those costs, maybe not, but we're selling them for more than we purchased them. In many cases, we purchased them under advantageous circumstances.
Well, can I see a breakdown of, just a financial breakdown of what we purchased them for, what we've invested in them, and then what our expected sale is on each of the homes?
Madam Chair, we can prepare that report.
Good, that'd be good. I'm just kind of curious where we're at financially with, especially with capital dollars.
Have a question?
I may have missed this. Those that are living in the current home, if they're unable to purchase the home, do they get relocated? Do we have homes already available for them to be relocated?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, it's a great question, and where our residents are a focus of everything we do. So we'll have the 180 to 360 days to, while HUD is considering the application, to prepare our residents who are already on notice. We are going to seek to relocate them within scattered site housing near their jobs and schools as much as we possibly can. We see a turnover of 5 to 8 units per week across our portfolio, so there should be plenty of time for people to relocate. We anticipate once it's approved, about 6 months for people to have an opportunity to find the right fit for their new home.
Okay, thank you.
And I would say just the more we can encourage people, if they want to move to Section 32, that certainly would be good news. And great. I think we're ready for a motion. Move approval for staff recommendation, perhaps? I guess I don't think, if you want to make the motion, that'd be great.
I move approval of staff recommendation.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Thank you. He came back
I
after
know, I
all
was just
that
gonna say,
abuse.
I'm-
Madam Chair and
Yeah.
subcommittee members, at the risk of further torture, I have returned. We're here to talk about a house that the Street Transportation Department owns, is historic and in need of substantial repair, and we don't intend to use it for the official home of the Street Transportation Director. So we are recommending that we find another user for this. And so I'm going to turn it over to the team here from Streets, NSD, and Historic Preservation to talk about what we're talk about this house and also what we're proposing to do.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, we're here to seek approval of the Saks Webster Farmstead request for proposal for the sale of a city-owned historic property at the southwest corner of 75th Avenue and Baseline. Erica Finbrotten from Planning and Development, Historic Preservation, and Rito Valina from Street Transportation will provide you the background and history on this property.
The property currently sits, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. The property is surrounded by a dirt lot. There's a retention pond and drainage channel there. And this is a picture of the house. The Saks Webster Farmstead was built in 1909 by Wolf Saks. He was a Russian immigrant and cattle rancher. It's one of the very few historic homes that we have in Laveen that especially is associated with the farming context there. The ownership changed many times over the years, and in 1968 the Webster family purchased the property and owned it until 2002. The property was placed on the Phoenix Historic Property Register in 2003. Character-defining features include the pyramidal roof with the flared eaves, asphalt shingles and clay tiles on the ridge lines. It has rusticated concrete block walls, Ionic order columns on the partial inset front porch, wood double-hung windows, and two wood frame shed additions that were previously sleeping porches. Oh. There we go. The exterior of the house has substantial integrity. This looks very much like it did when Mr. Saks built the property, although the interior was completely modernized in the 1960s. All of the outbuildings and the non-historic Webster house were demolished. The outside of the house shows weathering on the wooden elements. The roof is in very poor condition, and the roof framing does have some sagging and would need to be worked on. The mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems are inactive, missing, or at the end of their useful life.
Please note the temporary fence and graffiti. So,
It now, from what I understand, has a permanent fence that was installed, hopefully to make it a little more difficult to do that. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Erica. So how do we get here? This goes back about 14 years through a public-private partnership working with the Flood Control District, Salt River Project, and at the time there were about 11 landowners that were looking at, out of the 11, 10 landowners that were looking at development. And through the partnership with the Flood Control District, we looked at a project, and that's the green band that you see through this map. This is the watershed area that extends from the Gila boundary on the west side, south of southern baseline area, all the way to 43rd Avenue. And so we saw this as a great opportunity to collaborate with the landowners, with the 10 landowners, where they provided the land, and working with the Flood Control District, it was about a $20 million project minus the land. but there was still a property that we needed to purchase because that landowner, Mr. Webster, was not gonna develop his land. It was a small parcel, and we saw that we needed to purchase that property, and so that's how we ended up getting that property for this project. So it was a pretty good project, as you all have seen or have probably seen out there. I mean, there was a lot of homes that were taken out of a floodplain. There was a floodplain intended for this area, and because of the Levine Area Conveyance Channel, that floodplain was not created, and provides not only a flood control system, but also provides an amenity out there for the community. This picture just shows sort of the three elements that we're looking at that are going to be incorporated into the RFP: the house structure area, the pathway to get to the structure area, and then also a portion of baseline that would have to be dedicated because of the geometrics of the area for baseline road. Also, in the consideration for the criteria, we're looking at ultimately purchasing or having a negotiated price for the purchase. It it capitalizes on the land that we own. It also rehabilitates the historic nature of the structure, and it meets also the city's historic preservation commitments to the community and moving forward with this.
So the Neighborhood Services Department is going to assist with the RFP process for the sale and redevelopment of this property. If we receive subcommittee recommendation for council approval, we will move to City Council on November 5th for that approval. Upon that approval, we'll issue the RFP December 19th with proposals due in January, the end of January. We will come back to this subcommittee in March 15th or in March 2015 in order to seek subcommittee approval and then follow up April's council approval, and hope to convey the property to the awardee in May of 2015.
Wonderful.
So,
Any questions? All right, motion?
Motion to move forward. Sooner the better. Oh, sorry. Motion to move it forward.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you for your work to protect this important historic building.
Rick.
Where are you going?
Great job, Erica. Thanks.
I heard about the Stanford Gate this week after last year. By the way, it was one of those. Did I ever tell you that we won? No, I saw it.
Congratulations to
That was last
ASU.
Yeah. No, that was last year's for Stanford. Rick gave me a hard time.
Well, here's your opportunity, Sal.
The win provides the opportunity.
Welcome our Human Services Director to provide us an update on the Safe Place program.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much. We're here to talk to you about a new partnership and program called The Safe Place, new to us at least. I have with me Cynthia Schuler. She's the CEO of Tumbleweed. And before we begin, I'd just like to thank Councilman Valenzuela. He's been the champion for youth at risk, especially those facing homelessness, and that's why we find ourselves pressing to look for more opportunities. So we thank you, Councilman. Safe Place is a national organization, actually, and it's managed in Maricopa County by Tumbleweed and has been doing so since 2005. And it really creates a safety net where youth can find very specific agencies that have been trained and have volunteers that know how to interact with them. Across the nation, agencies report that 1 million youth leave home, run away from home throughout the year on an annual basis. And they're many, many times seeking a safe place. They've run away because of abuse and neglect, because of unsafe home situations. They've been kicked out by the family. There's, for themselves or maybe their family members, there's alcohol and abuse, substance abuse running throughout the family. So how does a youth find a safe place? There's several ways. One is they can certainly call the Tumbleweed Crisis Hotline, which is 24/7. They can text the word safe and their address into a specific number. They can call the national hotline. but most find themselves talking to somebody like Jennifer Rocha, who is in the audience and is a Safe Place coordinator, where they receive cards that explains the program, and they keep it with them in their backpack, and if there's a time that they need to, they pull it out. And so when they call and find out where the nearest location is, or they see the symbol and walk in, the staff there, like our staff that we want to have involved in this, have been trained, and they know how to interact with the youth, know the kinds of things that they need to be sensitive to. And they've designated already a place where they can sit and quietly wait, because what's going to happen is Tumbleweed's going to go and pick them up and take care of whatever issue that it may be, contacting a family member or food, whatever it might be. So that's what we are involved in. Our Family Advocacy Center, our 3 family service centers, John F. Long, Travis L. Williams, and Sunny Slope, are all involved in this. So we're going to be training our caseworkers to be aware, and we're planning to implement November the 1st. So we're very excited, and Tumbleweed, of course, is known throughout the community, and Cynthia's taking the agency to greater heights. So that's all we have today. If you have any questions for us.
Wonderful. Thank you for your leadership on keeping our youth safe. And thank you to Councilman Valenzuela.
Thank you, thank you, all of our partners there at Tumbleweed, and we have some amazing members of our city staff. Mo, you are wonderful, and Deanna, you're great, and obviously everyone is on board to do what we can to help our youth, especially those that find themselves in a situation like this. So you continue to answer the call. It seems like and you heard it again today, where we continue to challenge city staff. You continue just to rise to the occasion. I can't think of a more important topic than this when we're dealing with our youth at risk. So thank you for all the effort.
I want to thank Councilman Valenzuela and staff for bringing this forward. I think it's a great idea. It just provides information to the public, to the youth. There is a place that you can go to. I think it's fantastic. I want to thank you for bringing it forward. I had not heard of this before. I think it's fantastic. And people deserve to be protected. They need to feel safe. And if a youth doesn't feel safe in their environment, they now know that there's an opportunity for them to go somewhere that they could feel safe, even if it's a short period of time. Oh, thank you for bringing it forward. I think that's great.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now the phase out of the men's overflow shelter, an issue of great interest and importance to our community.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. We have Bruce Liggett, who is the Director of the Human Services Department for the Maricopa County, and Brian Spicker, Senior Vice President for Community Impact for Value Sun United Way. They're going to really do the yeoman's work here on the presentation. We're here to talk to you about the phase out of the men's overflow shelter located at 1214 West Madison. Just in a brief background, the MOS, the Men's Overflow Shelter, was opened in the summer of 2007, really in response to unusually high temperatures. And it provides temporary short-term shelter for single individuals that are experiencing street homelessness. The facility is owned by Maricopa County, and that's why Bruce is here to talk about this important issue, and we certainly are very much in partnership with Maricopa County. It's funded primarily by the county as well as the Department of Housing. The Department of Housing, Director Traylor, and the Department of Economic Security, the State Homeless Coordinator, have been the other two partners that have been discussing and working on this issue. The facility can shelter up to 250 single men or men actually each night. So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce to review the status of the building that's actually being used and the phase-out strategies that we've been working on. Thanks, Mo, Madam Chair, council members.
Good morning.
So I wanted to quickly walk through, as requested, some of the background in terms of how we got to where we are now. I've been with the county just a short period of time now, and this issue kind of raised its head shortly after I arrived. We learned beginning in January that there were some structural issues with the county-owned building that Cass uses to operate the men's overflow shelter. And we began to examine whether those would be something that could be remedied, and they were clearly cost prohibitive. It didn't make sense to try to put that much money into it. And the further we looked at it, the further code issues became clear. So it's very clear that that building is not good for human habitation at this point. And you can see from the slide, especially the one with the crowded folks laying on the floor, how packed in people can be on some nights at the shelter. What I was most impressed with was that this was quickly, we agreed it was not a Cass problem, it wasn't a county problem, it wasn't a city problem, it was a regional problem that we all had to address. And I was really pleased that the state partners, DES and the Housing Department, along with our private partner, Valley Sun United Way, came together and said, let's see what we can do to fix this situation. So you can see those are the participants that have been working with this. And Mo and Deanna have been great at making sure the police department's been involved and active and at the table for many of our meetings, and we've been talking about this. What we all did is kind of scramble quickly to see what kind of resources we could bring to bear. So our goal was to place these people into housing, permanent housing, to rapidly rehouse them, because that's better than short-term shelter options anyhow. And so both the city and the county repurposed some existing HUD monies to be able to use for rapid rehousing. DES identified some of their funds and transferred it in. So what we did is we started to put together a plan around the success of the elimination of chronic homeless among veterans, the H3 plan. We said, let's use that model as our guiding principle here. And so we did that. We crafted an RFP. We issued an RFP, and that RFP has been awarded. It's a county RFP with state and county federal funds in it. It was awarded to Community Bridges, who's got experience doing this. They're in partnership with Home Inc., who finds places for people to live. Let me see, and who is also working with the Human Services Campus as a formal partner in this. So that team has already been meeting to begin planning this. They're looking at several approaches, not just using the funds we gathered to places, but try to divert some of these folks from coming into the shelter in the first time, and then looking at the whole array. So the city, county, state, and Valley Sun United Way are also looking at who else can be partners in this. So that's why we refer to it, it's a phase out, it's not an overnight closure. We've got a step down of the maximum number of people who will be allowed to be in the shelter by month. That step down has not begun yet, so this is a 6-month process. We're going to monitor it very closely to see what's happening. If we need to reevaluate any of the steps that we're planning, we're going to do so. So we're in it to see that this is done responsibly and timely, both. Brian, I think, was going to talk about where we're going, because this is just a short-term issue in terms of our work together.
Madam Chair, council members, it's a pleasure to be here, and really part of an indication of how well public and private can work together around a significantly wicked problem. And the Sun United Way is excited to be here because we've made a lot of progress around our goal of achieving 1,000 units for the chronically homeless individual, which included many of the veterans in that H3 success. So our experience has been, if you bring some additional funders to the table, the resources should be there to help those individuals that might fall through some of the gaps as we move this forward. And our desire is to convene both public and private partners, not the public partners that are already here, but there are others, as Mo and Bruce have stated. It's a regional issue, and many public jurisdictions have always felt it's been a downtown Phoenix issue. So we want to seek any additional funds that would close any gaps that might occur as we deal with the remainder of the men's overflow shelter population. And then also to meet our ongoing needs for permanent supportive housing. It's because systems are working well, better. They're not perfect, but better that we can actually entertain taking this step. So we're excited to be here and part of it.
Thank you. Thank you all for your leadership in addressing the issue around homelessness. If that concludes the presentation, we do have a card from Reed Butler. Reed, if you wanted to. Reed is in favor of this item.
Thank you, Chair Gallego. Is this on? Yes. So Reed Butler, 42 West Mariposa Street. I'm the owner of Butler Housing Company. I'm also a Stanford grad, 1978. Thank you very much, Councilwoman Pastor.
Yes, you.
Yeah, I was out of town, fortunately. So I'm here I'd like to give a little background, and I think I can get this done in 2 minutes, Chair. But so we're the largest private property owner in the Capitol Mall. We built a property called Legacy Bungalows back in 1999. It's a $17 million investment. We had lots of partners in that project. This is when I was the partner for Legacy Partners. That's a site that we assembled through Michael Lee. We had a lot of support. Councilman DeCiccio was on the council back then, 1999, I believe that's right. We had support from Governor Hull. We had support from Councilman Lingner. This was in District 7. We also had support from Congressman Pastor when we did that project. Part of the key to coming into the Capitol Mall was to see how the issue around the Human Services Campus was going to be managed going forward. And this was an exciting time. There was about a $20+ million project being led by the county, which a lot of people participated in. And so we were very pleased to see that happen. The reason I'm here today, really two points I'd like to make that have questions in them. But the first point is maybe understanding better where the relocation is going to take place. I think one of you may have already raised this point. We've lost an awful lot of SRO, single room occupancy housing in downtown Phoenix. This is a huge need to find permanent housing, but it would be important, and maybe not today, maybe in follow-up, to understand more where these residents are going to go, because this is a huge need. And I would offer, I'm on the board of the Arizona Multi-Housing Association. We'd be happy to work with your team as that goes forward and see if there might be a role. Despite the recovery, we have lots of vacant apartments. So maybe there's some discussion we could have with the Arizona Multi-Housing Association. The other point I'd like to make is really may I have 30 more seconds, please? There's been a lot of planning going on in downtown. We know this urban form plan, Reinvent Phoenix plan. I mean, the list kind of goes on. But the Capitol Mall is really not getting, in my personal opinion, the attention it might get. We have this discussion about downtown ending at 7th Avenue. And we all know it doesn't end at 7th Avenue. You have Grand Avenue. Ms. Pastor, you were talking about a few minutes ago. We have Grand Avenue that's seen lots of investment. We're involved in 4 projects there. We have things happening east of 7th Street as we move toward St. Luke's, that whole discussion. But we seem not to have as much attention as maybe we could have in the Capitol Mall. We're about to have a new governor. I mean, either way, we're about to have a new governor. There are going to be ongoing discussions around the Human Services Campus, I would expect, as this initiative takes place and maybe other initiatives take place. So maybe there's another opportunity here to engage with leadership at lots of different levels and with private property owners and see if we can really re-energize this discussion about the master plan for the Capitol Mall. We did have a lot of discussions recently when light rail was being planned to go through the Capitol Mall. The St. Matthews neighborhood was part of that discussion. So maybe as part of this collaboration, as we work with the campus and think about helping the campus find these solutions, we could also work with others in the Capitol Mall and reinvigorate some of these planning discussions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. In response to his question, could you tell us a little bit about the maximum occupancy at the men's overflow shelter and the number of units in the RFP and some of that in terms of timeline?
The maximum occupancy is about 240, and it varies significantly up to 100 on any given night from that. They may even exceeded that number in the past month, a couple nights, but we've been talking, the working number's 240 that we've been talking about. So we know that with the RFP that we've awarded, that we expect 85 placements out of that. We're working with the Maricopa County contract with CAS, specifies that an additional 45 people will be moved within CAS. In addition, we're working with these other groups to identify where there are housing throughout the valley to see where these individuals can be placed, and diversion. So many people just coming to the door as the step down occurs and the number gets smaller, then those people will have an opportunity to talk to the Welcome Center at the Human Services Campus to see what their needs are in the short term and be able to try to place them. Some of the money in this contract that we've awarded allows for placement of rent, and over a period of time then we work with these individuals. We have navigators, they're called, like case managers who have experience in this area, work with them to try and get employment and benefits so that they can pick up their share then of the rent.
Councilman Valenzuela, did you? DeCiccio?
Just a couple of questions. I was here in the 90s, and I saw what happened when this whole idea got created, where you centralized many of the homeless where they felt a safe place to go, and it took a lot of time. The concerns I have would be more along the unintended consequences as we're moving forward. The whole idea of locating individuals in one place literally kept them away from the downtown area, which then allowed us to reinvigorate this area. The Capitol Mall is one of the next areas for reinvigoration, and I get what we needed to be doing there. So there's multiple things that, just as a caveat, looking at what potentially could happen. You don't want to be able to put a situation in place where then now they're coming, the homeless are now feeling that they ought to be able to sleep at a parklet or somewhere else in downtown Phoenix. So we've got to be able to monitor that. The second thing is I would really consider, if you look at the city of Phoenix, we are 40% of the valley. Maybe we consider 40% of those homeless, but the other 60% need to be able to go in other locations as well as you're moving forward. When you're talking about it being a regional problem, it is a regional problem. The reason that people gravitated to the downtown area is because that's where the services were. People are going to gravitate to the services. They're going to gravitate to those areas. And plus, every major city deals with this. It's not an uncommon situation. So as you're looking for a plan, which I agree with, the way to handle the chronically homeless is to find permanent locations for them. The other part of it deals with the fairness issue from that 40% that would be in the city of Phoenix. You can't look at, because we're dealing with another issue dealing with individuals with sex crimes. They're all congregating in one area. It's not fair to any one community, whether it's in Phoenix or whether it's outside of Phoenix or whether it's in one specific area in the city. So to look at that as well. And that's really how you create assimilation anyways. You get people assimilated into an area, you've got to be able to assimilate them into an area and let them see that there are other ways of living other than through homelessness. So I commend you for it, but as you move forward, there are unintended consequences that can move with this, and to look at that, but also look at the fairness issue of where should they go, where should they not go, and it's really not fair for one city to be able to handle those problems. It just isn't.
And as a related question to that, will you be speaking with other city councils about this issue, since it is not a Phoenix problem alone?
The long-term plan is to engage them. So the funding for the overflow shelter today is just county funds and some state funds. And both the county and the city are funders of the overflow shelter. The city funds the main shelter at CAS. The city funds more than the county. But so yeah, this has been kind of a county and city thing, and we'd like to over time engage some of the local communities in these discussions.
The word overtime is lingo for us that it may or may not happen, just letting you know. That's what I hear. So I would encourage you to follow Councilwoman Gallego's recommendation to engage other cities and do it now. And the other is to look at the multi-housing industry as an area that might be able to provide some housing for individuals in a more permanent basis. So I want to be more clear. I think you heard the direction from myself and others up here that you need to look at other cities too. You know, this is a problem that everyone needs to engage in.
Sure.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Member, Councilman DeCiccio, yeah, it's a great offer. We'll certainly talk to Mr. Butler, and just on the continuing care in reference to the city and other sharing, it is very crystal clear that everyone is understanding the equity issue, and I couldn't agree more that now is the time, and I think this is the catalyst. This is the thing that's going to catapult us, but it's just the beginning. Housing is the answer. Scattered sites and being able to place people through all these diversion techniques that have been proven effective in H3 is really part of the answer, and that's where we're heading. Thank you.
And the 85 units or people in the RFP, is that scattered sites? Is that what you're contemplating?
Yes, so there's rapid rehousing, and it depends on their situation. It could be seriously mentally ill housing, it could be a permanent supportive housing, it could be rapid rehousing, but they are all scattered, you know, throughout, and it just depends on that individual, the peer navigator that's going to work with that individual, and what is the best choice for that individual.
And so we have, you said 240 was sort of the max level, and we're not quite there in terms of units where we know we can place people yet. Can you talk about how you'll fill that gap?
Madam Chair, the combination of diverting people who show up, the placement of those at least 85, that's the minimum in the RFP contract. The looking at today, currently CAS takes in an average of 2 people every day from the overflow shelter into their permanent shelter. So capturing those as part of the natural flow into that is important also. And then CAS will be adding 45. So we're getting close to the number in terms of diversions. We're not able to pin down yet, and that's why we're going to have to monitor what the impact of that is. And with the other partners who are offering the state in terms of the mental health settlement, got funds for housing. They're offering to work with us to find some of that, so we're very interested in pursuing all of those.
I think the other, another piece is in this 1,000 units by 2015, there is a pipeline of units that are coming available over time. So these individuals, if they're meeting the definition of chronically homeless, those individuals can fit into that pipeline so that they are maintained in those permanent situations. I think the other piece on working with the other cities is this sensitization, and Valley of the Sun United Way has been engaged through our Project Connect activities, which is really bringing a connect activity in a city across Maricopa County, tying homeless services to the population that's showing up in that city, inviting jurisdictional leaders to be there to see that it's truly a regional issue. So we've been working on it. It's and expect to be convening around that.
Fabulous. So we do not anticipate additional people sleeping outside as a result of this closure?
The goal is not to increase the number of sleep outside. We're talking about, this plan, again, is short-term and addresses the overflow shelter, the county building. It does not address the whole numbers down there at the campus now and what to do with that, but we've got discussions with groups even tomorrow about what the next step is around that.
I have some questions. So the men's overflow holds 240. How many are turned away from the 240? How many are we aware of that cannot enter the men's overflow and are out in the neighborhoods?
Councilwoman Pastor, it varies. Many nights there's openings in the overflow shelter. Some nights people are turned away and they'll be sleeping in the parking lot, but they may get in the next day. We don't have really good data about how many people move around between the different settings there. But I know some nights people can get in the overflow shelter, men.
There's definitely a churning effect between the men's overflow, the CAS shelter, and the parking lot. There's a churning that goes on there. Part of what this project is going to do is really intensify an understanding of what's happening in the area for us to address all of those things.
Okay, because if I'm doing my math correctly, to 240, then there'll be 85 transitional housing or housing or 85 units, I'm just gonna use units, that's 155 people still outstanding. And I heard 45 may come from CAS, or there's some housing, 45. So that's 130, and we still have 110 that are still moving about, or they'll, because how I'm understanding it, eventually the men's overflow will be slowly phasing out. So then it's possibility of 110 individuals that do not have current housing. So then what happens? Does CAS, other agencies, we try to divert them to other agencies, but if they choose not to go to, say, another agency that's in Tempe or Mesa, Scottsdale, we still have a dynamic and issue. So how do we handle that?
We had
And I
this-
know these are big.
part of this is, yes, these are,
This
so
is
we're
as
not
we
solving.
go, we learn.
We're not
So I
solving
get
the whole
that.
problem.
Yeah.
We had to start transitioning out of the overflow shelter. My board, the County Board of Supervisors, is very clear that we couldn't just turn our backs on these issues.
Right.
And if something happened there, we'd all be responsible and liable. So that was serious. And so it's been quite a time getting to where we are now. I think Mo's point was very important. It's not a stable group of 240 people in there. There's incredible churn. Some people use it once a month for many weeks. They just come there and use it. So part of what we're trying to do is we got a list of everybody who was in the facility on September 15th. And that's the list we're working. CAS has flexibility within a month to kind of prioritize if there's emergency situations. But we're going to work that list and be able to report back to you how many were there, and then we lose them in the system. So many people come and stop by and go. So those people won't avail themselves to housing anyhow.
So, and that's true, because we're also dealing with some behavioral health and mental health issues.
Right.
And so my concern, as I would assume many of my colleagues' concern, is when this starts to phase out and happen, it's all going to start entering neighborhoods where we have done a great job in working collectively together to keep our neighborhoods safe. But it's going to start flowing from our downtown area all the way up, I would say, in some of the neighborhoods, or our Margaret Hance Park, our Encano Park, our Indian Steel. And so I just want to have a bigger picture, a wide view as to, all right, if this begins, what is our plan? So that's just where I'm going in the big picture. And I'll admit, in 2006, I sat on the homeless task force. So I also am aware of the dynamics from 2006 to where we are today. And so, and the monies that were available then, and how they were distributed. So we're trying to solve the problem in 2006 and distributed money, and CAS was built, and I don't think we ever can, anticipated how this whole dynamic was going to happen until we're living in the moment at this moment. And now we're still at the point where we still need to solve and put other pieces into play. So that's where my thought process is coming from because of my experience. So thank you. Yes.
I think Councilwoman Pastor brings up a really good point. Again, going back in history in order to figure out what's going to happen in the future. I mean, human nature doesn't change that much. But if you look back in the history, one of the issues that did come up back in literally in the 90s was the fact that there were so many homeless living in our neighborhoods. And now we created this huge dynamic downtown and great neighborhoods surrounding the downtown. The question is when you start upsetting the apple cart, what happens next? Where do they go? And without a thorough plan, I would really caution our staff to be very careful on this, in particular in those neighborhoods surrounding the downtown. I think she brings up an incredibly valid point that doesn't seem to be quite answered yet, or at least in this presentation, of where do they go?
Yep, and we would love to ask our partners at the county just to be cognizant that the neighborhoods around Cass do provide an important, they do more than their fair share of helping us address.
Okay, so we have, Madam Chair and Council, we do have a project team. They've already met as soon as the RFP was signed. They're meeting again this afternoon. We're going to be monitoring and watching very closely. All of the concerns that you've brought up are real. We know that. We've been discussing them as we've moved forward. The various diversion techniques that we will employ, some people will literally divert on their own. Some will need rapid rehousing. We have the funding for that. Some will need. We do have capacity in the regional behavioral health system for units. We know those things, and we really have to take a strong hold of it. There's absolutely no intent, of course, to just release into the neighborhoods. That's complete opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. But housing first is the answer, as we've heard, and that's where we're heading. We've got a proven model. It's national best practice. We're going to take hold of it and move forward.
Hey, Mo, so you can't retire anytime soon.
That would be next week.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your hard work on this difficult issue. Not a lot of easy answers. Future agenda items. Call to the public. We do not have any cards at the moment, so we are adjourned.